The storm had been pounding the Colorado Rockies since late afternoon, but sometime around 3 in the morning, it turned vicious, an all-out whiteout that swallowed the ridgeline and hammered Jack Miller's cabin as if the wind wanted in. Jack had been a firefighter for nearly 20 years before a wildfire took half his crew and left him with lungs that burned every winter. Now he worked maintenance at the regional weather outpost, living alone on the mountain where the cold air stayed sharp, but the memories stayed quiet. Tonight, though, something cut through the storm louder than his thoughts. A thin, dragging sound that scraped across his front door like a single fingernail on wood. He lay still at first, listening. The wind often slapped branches into the siding, and ice could shift in odd ways during storms. But this wasn't random. It came again, slow, weak, almost pleading. Jack swung his legs off the bed, boots half-laced, flashlight in hand. As he crossed the living room, the LED thermometer on the wall blinked negative numbers he didn't want to think about. Temperatures like this could kill a grown man without a working heater, let alone any wildlife that got caught in it. He opened the door a crack, and the wind immediately tore it wider. Snow blasted in. Jack braced his shoulder against the doorframe to hold it steady, wiping frost from his eyes before lowering the flashlight beam to the porch. What he saw there froze him more completely than the cold ever could. A mother bobcat lay collapsed in the drift, her sides heaving in shallow, desperate rhythm. Her body was so thin he could see ribs to her matted winter coat, and pressed against her belly were 3 tiny kittens, motionless, stiff from the cold, their fur crusted in ice. Another kitten lay a few inches away, limp in the snow, small enough to fit in one of Jack's hands. For a moment, the scene didn't make sense. Bobcats avoided humans, especially a cabin that smelled of diesel heaters and old fire gear. They didn't drag themselves out into blizzards, and they sure didn't bring their newborns to a stranger's doorstep. But then the mother bobcat lifted her head. It trembled in the air as if it weighed as much as her whole body. She turned slightly, and the porch light caught the bare patch around her neck. Skin scarred in a perfect ring, fur missing, a wound only one kind of cruelty left behind. A snare. A wire snare. Jack's breath caught. He knew that scar. 8 months earlier, under a highway overpass, he'd found young Bobcat hanging by a tightening loop of wire, choking and thrashing until her paws scraped concrete. He'd cut her free while she stared at him with eyes too bright for an animal trapped and dying. He had bolted before he could treat her. He had spent weeks wondering if she survived. And now, here she was, dragging herself through a lethal blizzard with her frozen babies to his door. Jack knelt in the snow, his knees immediately soaking through his pants, and reached toward the smallest kitten. It didn't move. He pressed 2 fingers gently to its chest, expecting nothing. Then, a faint tremor, so faint he thought he imagined it, fluttered beneath his touch. "You're alive," he whispered, the words barely forming through the tightness in his throat. "You're still fighting." The mother bobcat tried to shift, nudging her remaining kittens toward him with what little strength she had. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't fear. It was trust so raw and undeserved it made Jack's eyes burn. She wasn't asking to be saved. She was asking him to save them. The wind roared, pushing snow into the seams of the cabin door, and Jack knew he had seconds, not minutes, to act. He lifted the first kitten into his coat, cradling the tiny, freezing body against his chest where his own warmth might buy it time. Then the second, then the third. Each one felt lighter than the last, as if the storm had already started taking its claim. When he reached for the final kitten, the one he had mistaken for dead, the mother bobcat's head dropped into the snow, her body slackening as though the effort had finally broken her. "Hey," Jack said softly, touching her shoulder, his voice cracking in the cold air. "Stay with me. I've got them. I'm here." He gathered the kittens in his arms, pushing the door open with his shoulder. Warm air spilled out, carrying scents of old wood smoke and old blankets. It wasn't much, but it was life. Before stepping inside, he looked back at the mother bobcat, lying still in the swirling snow. For the briefest second, her amber eyes opened, meeting his with that same recognition from months ago, a look that crossed the impossible distance between wild instinct and human memory. Jack swallowed hard. "You found the right door," he whispered. Inside the cabin, as he set the kittens near the stove and reached for emergency blankets, he glanced toward the small radio transmitter on the table. In the background, the automated weather warning played again. "Extreme risk. Stay indoors." The kind of message he helped record for the weather station. He let out a breath, grabbed a towel, and muttered to himself, "If there was ever a night for a miracle." Before the scene faded into the quiet crackle of the stove, Jack spoke aloud, more to the empty cabin than to anyone in particular. "If you're out there listening, stories like this matter. Lives like these matter. Folks who want to hear them, well, they can find them on the Whispering Hearts channel. Someone should witness moments like this. Someone should remember them." His voice wasn't promotional or loud, just a tired man speaking honestly to the silence, a natural pause in a long, cold night. Outside, the storm screamed against the cabin walls, promising the worst was still coming. But inside, on a wool blanket beneath the stove, 3 tiny lives trembled back toward warmth. "Hold on," he murmured. "Just hold on."
The kittens lay bundled in towels near the stove, their tiny chests rising in stuttering breaths as the heat finally began to seep into them. Jack worked quietly, moving between the stove and the mother bobcat still collapsed on the porch. He kept the door cracked, just enough to reach her, not wanting the room to lose precious warmth. Snow continued to whip across the steps, coating her fur in a thin, icy glaze. She looked smaller than he remembered, lighter, as if the months of surviving with that brutal wire scar had stripped her down to nothing but instinct and grit. Jack crouched beside her again, letting the porch light fall across her neck. The old wound was unmistakable. The ring-shaped scar where a snare had bitten into her skin was now thicker, darker, and harsher than before. Bits of metal still clung to the fur around it, twisted into a shape that made Jack's jaw tighten. He remembered the day he cut it loose, a hot July afternoon under a concrete bridge where the air smelled of oil and dust. He remembered how she'd hung there, her hind legs kicking wildly while blood streaked the metal rail behind her. He had prayed he wasn't too late. He reached out now, brushing snow from her ears, and felt the heat of her shallow breath. The way she looked at him, barely conscious but aware, sent a tight ache across his chest. She wasn't afraid. Even now, when she had every reason to run, she was still here, lying within arm's reach of a human. That wasn't normal. It wasn't natural. It was trust built on something deeper than instinct, and Jack felt the weight of it as sharply as the cold wind biting through his coat. Inside the cabin, one of the kittens released a thin cry, more a tremor of sound than a real mewl. It meant the warmth was working, but it also tugged Jack's attention away just long enough for a memory to surge back. After he freed this bobcat months ago, he had searched for her trail, followed the drops of blood through weeds and broken concrete until they vanished into a thicket near the river. He'd knelt in that grass, listening for movement, whispering apologies into the empty air. "I should have been faster. I should have found you." For weeks afterward, he woke at night thinking about the ring of wire tightening around a throat that had trusted him for just a moment. Seeing her now, on his porch, half frozen, carrying the weight of motherhood and miles of storm, made the guilt return full force. It also made something else rise in him, a fierce, protective urgency he hadn't felt in years. Jack slid his arms under her body, lifting carefully to avoid her injured neck. She didn't fight. Her head sagged against his jacket like she had been waiting for him to carry her inside. Snow fell from her fur as he stepped through the door, closing out the storm behind them. He set her gently on a blanket beside the stove, arranging her so the heat could reach her legs and chest without overwhelming her weakened body. "Easy now," he murmured, adjusting her position. "You made it. You're safe." Her breathing hitched, then steadied. For a brief second, her amber eyes opened again, focusing on him with the same clarity he'd seen under the bridge all those months ago. It wasn't a wild glare or a defensive stare. It was recognition, the kind that burrows under a man's skin and stays there. Jack felt something inside him shift, a quiet breaking that wasn't pain, but something close to release. Maybe it was relief that she was alive. Maybe it was the fact that she had chosen him out of an entire mountain of danger and shadow. Or maybe it was simply the realization that in her moment of absolute desperation, she hadn't gone to shelter or to instinct. She had come to a memory. "Why'd you pick my door?" he asked softly, though he already knew. Because he hadn't hurt her. Because he tried. Because in her world full of traps and teeth, he had been the only thing that didn't bring pain. Jack checked the kittens again, tucking another blanket around them before turning back to the mother bobcat. The storm hammered the cabin walls, but inside the only sound was the soft rattle of her breathing and the slow ticking of the stove as it warmed the room. He sat on the floor beside her, back against the wall, watching her chest rise and fall, slow but steady. "You remember me, and I won't fail you this time."
Long before the blizzard, long before the mother bobcat dragged herself through a world of white to reach Jack's cabin, there had been a scorching July afternoon when the sun baked the concrete of Highway 72 until it shimmered like molten glass. Jack remembered that day with painful clarity, not because of what he did, but because of what he couldn't finish. He had been on his usual maintenance route for the weather outpost, checking wind equipment installed near the overpass. The air smelled of hot tar and sagebrush, and the only sounds were the hum of traffic above and the dry chirr of cicadas in the scrub below. Nothing about the day hinted at what he was about to find. He first heard it as a rasping choke, a sound so strangled it didn't register as animal at all. Jack had paused, listening, thinking it might be an engine misfiring on the road above, but then it came again, short, desperate, scraping like sandpaper rubbed across metal. Instinct tugged him down the embankment toward the underside of the bridge. The ground there was littered with broken glass and discarded bottles, the kind of place teenagers sneaked off to or where wildlife wandered by mistake. As he got closer, the sound sharpened, and Jack's stomach tightened with a familiar sense of dread, the kind he'd carried into burning buildings too many times to count. Under the shadow of the bridge, he finally saw her. A young bobcat hung from a snare anchored to a steel support beam, her front paws clawing furiously at the air while her hind legs scraped the ground. The wire had cinched tight around her neck, the metal biting through fur into skin. Each time she tried to twist free, the loop tightened, cutting deeper. Her breathing was ragged, broken by sharp, choking jerks. She wasn't fighting anymore. She was fading. Jack moved without thinking, the way he used to when someone was trapped under collapsed roofing or tangled in rebar. He spoke to her, not because she could understand the words, but because animals could sense tone, and he needed her to know he wasn't another threat. "Easy, easy now. I've got you." He pulled the multi-tool from his belt and reached for the wire, angling the blade so he wouldn't nick her throat. Her eyes locked on him, golden, wide, terrified. But there was something else there too, a flicker of awareness, a question. Are you here to save me or finish me? When the wire snapped, her full weight collapsed into Jack's arms. She was surprisingly heavy for such a small frame, all muscle and survival.
He lowered her to the ground, holding her steady as her chest heaved and air returned to her lungs in painful gulps. Blood trickled from the raw ring encircling her neck. Jack tried to keep her calm, murmuring softly, "You're okay. I've got you. Stay with me." For one brief moment, she didn't try to run. For one brief moment, she leaned into him, too weak to do anything but breathe. But instinct is a powerful thing. The second she regained enough strength, she twisted violently, slipping from his arms and bolting into the scrub brush. Jack lunged after her with a medkit in hand, calling out, "I can help, wait!" But wild animals don't wait. He followed the blood drops until they vanished into thickets of rabbit brush and rock. After that, there was nothing but silence. He'd spent hours that day circling the area, crawling under bushes, scanning for any sign she might still be alive. Not a track, not a broken twig, nothing. When the sun finally dipped low and the heat shimmer faded into purple dusk, Jack stood alone beneath that bridge, feeling the familiar burn of failure settle in his chest. He'd cut her free, yes, but not in time to tend the wound, not in time to save her from the infection he feared was inevitable. Driving home that night, he replayed her gasping breaths, the torn flesh around her neck, and the look she gave him right before she ran. It stayed with him long after summer turned to fall. Later, when snow began dusting the ridges, he found himself checking the traps around the property, scanning for any sign she might still be alive. Each time he found nothing, the guilt deepened. He told himself she was gone, that he shouldn't have let her slip away before treating her, that he should have been stronger, faster, smarter. But the wild doesn't bend for regret. And yet, 8 months later, she had come back to him, through a storm that killed anything caught in it, dragging her newborns across miles of frozen wilderness. She had remembered him, not the pain, not the fear, but the moment he saved her life. As Jack sat beside her now, watching her chest rise in shallow breaths, the memory of that day under the bridge felt more like a beginning than a failure. He wasn't sure if he believed in second chances, but she had given him one, and he wasn't going to waste it.
The cabin had begun to warm, but Jack still felt cold in places the stove couldn't reach, the kind of cold that lived under the ribs where memory settled in like old snow. He sat on the floor beside the mother bobcat, her breath shallow but steady, the kittens bundled close to the stove where their tiny bodies twitched with the first signs of returning life. Outside, the storm clawed at the windows, rattling them in their frames, but the sound barely touched the weight inside Jack's chest. He rubbed his palms together, not for warmth but to stop the faint trembling in his hands. It had been years, 4 to be exact, since he'd held anything fragile and felt certain he would break it. 4 years since he'd watched cancer hollow out the woman he loved. Since he'd stood helpless beside her hospital bed while machines beeped steadily and her fingers grew too thin for his to warm. 2 years after that, the wildfire had taken half his crew. Men he had trained with, fought beside, joked with through the worst nights on the line. He'd been the one pulled out last, coughing through scorched air, while someone shouted, "We've got him, he's still breathing." But breathing didn't mean living. Not after that. Jack had survived the kind of losses that strip a man down to bone. He'd buried more than most, carried guilt heavier than any equipment pack he'd ever worn, and spent the last few years convincing himself that some people simply didn't get second chances. His heart had felt like a locked cabin in winter. Quiet, closed, frozen. And yet, here he was, kneeling beside a wild creature who had somehow found him again. He looked down at the bobcat's neck, the scar running like a cruel necklace across her skin. The room flickered with the orange glow of the stove, and for a heartbeat, he saw her not as an animal, but as something painfully familiar, a survivor who had dragged herself through the worst storm of her life just to keep her children alive. She reminded him of Laura, his wife, who had fought with every ounce of strength she had until her last breath.
and of his crew who had pushed through flame and smoke because someone else needed them. Jack pressed his palms to his brow, exhaling slowly. "You shouldn't have had to do this alone," he whispered, to the Bobcat, to Laura, to his crew, to every ghost that clung to him. The mother Bobcat stirred faintly, her paw twitching. He reached over and adjusted the blanket around her. It was strange, really, comforting a creature whose kind would normally snarl at humans. But tonight, nothing about their world was normal. Tonight, life and death sat side by side on a wool blanket, shivering under the same storm. Jack forced himself to stand and check the kittens again. He scooped the smallest one into his palms, feeling its faint warmth through the towel. A tiny paw unfurled, barely touching his thumb. Something about that small gesture, the innocence of it, made a fracture appear inside him. Quiet but deep. "I'm not losing you. Not tonight." He moved back to the mother and knelt again. Her breathing grew slightly stronger, her shoulders rising a little higher with each inhale. He brushed a tired strand of hair off his forehead and studied her face, barely believing she was here. Months ago, he had walked away from that bridge convinced he had failed her. Another life he couldn't save, another memory to carry. But she had lived, somehow. Through pain and danger and months of recovery, she had survived. And not only that, she had remembered him. All the way through winter, through labor, through starvation, through the storm. She had remembered one moment of kindness and held on to it in a world that gave her none. Jack swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. "Why'd you trust me?" he asked, aloud, feeling foolish for expecting an answer, but in some way, he felt she had already given it. She trusted him because he had tried, even when failing seemed more likely than succeeding. The wind howled suddenly, slamming a branch against the window. Jack flinched, then rose and pulled the curtains closed. The memory of the man he used to be, the one who rushed into danger without thinking, surged up inside him. But that man had vanished years ago, buried under grief and disappointment. But tonight, something stirred. A fragment of that old fierceness. A spark he didn't realize he'd been missing. He returned to the Bobcat, lowering himself beside her once more. "I didn't save you right the first time," he murmured, "but I'm here now. I won't screw this up." Snow continued to lash the cabin, the storm unrelenting. But inside, the warmth grew stronger. The kittens drew steadier breaths, and the mother Bobcat lay still, exhausted but alive. Jack rested his hand on the floor beside her, not touching, but close enough for her to feel his presence. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. The storm had settled into a steady, punishing roar by the time Jack stepped away from the mother Bobcat to check the weather station panel mounted near his radio desk. The screen flickered under the strain of the power fluctuations, but the data was clear enough to make his stomach drop. Wind gusts were topping 60 miles an hour, temperatures plunging lower than anything forecasted earlier in the week. He'd lived through harsh winters in the Rockies, but this one felt different, sharper, meaner. The kind of storm that didn't just test endurance, but punished anything caught in its path. The automated warning broadcast crackled through the radio speakers. "Severe blizzard conditions. All residents shelter indoors. Visibility near zero." Jack knew most of the mountain cabins were empty this time of year. Folks with sense stayed closer to town. Only people like him, people running from something, or people who'd lost too much, chose isolation in weather like this. He turned down the radio volume, trying not to let the tension creeping up his spine show in his voice as he checked the kittens again. They were warmer now, bundled in towels, their tiny paws twitching with faint life. The smallest one pressed its muzzle weakly into the cloth, searching for comfort. Jack steadied himself against the table and exhaled. It was working. They were still fighting. Just as he reached for another blanket, the radio buzzed sharply, a priority call. Riley's voice came through, thin and distorted by the storm, but urgent enough to stop Jack cold. "Jack, you copy? We've got new activity near the East Ridge. Same type of snares we found last month." Jack stiffened. His hand hovered in the air, fingers curled halfway into a fist. "You think it's Briggs?" "Tracks look like his," Riley answered. "Snowmobile trail cut through 10 minutes before the whiteout hit. Looks like he came in quick, set a few traps and got out before the ridge closed." Jack's jaw tightened. Hunter Briggs wasn't just a poacher. He was the kind of man who hunted for trophies, not meat. Bobcat pelts fetched a high price, and Briggs didn't care if the animals died slow. Jack looked toward the mother bobcat, her body curled slightly around her frozen kittens, and something hot sparked behind his ribs. He knew exactly what kind of torment she'd survived months ago. Briggs didn't set his snares by accident. Riley continued, "Jack, listen. If you see anything unusual around your place, call it in. Do not go outside, and whatever you do, keep your doors locked." Jack frowned. "Why? You think he's still out here?" The radio hissed before Riley's voice returned, lower this time. "Because someone reported a snowmobile cutting across the slope near your cabin right before the storm hit. Could be him checking traps, could be him tracking something wounded. It's too early to know." Jack's eyes drifted to the window where the snow billowed in thick waves against the glass. He'd spotted tracks earlier, long, narrow, carved deep by heavy treads. He'd assumed it was a ranger patrol. Now he wasn't so sure. He lowered the radio slowly, trying not to let the tension creeping up his spine show in his voice. Briggs had a reputation, a temper too short, a rifle always loaded, and a belief that the rules didn't apply to him, especially when the snow hit his tracks. If he'd seen a weakened bobcat mother out there, one dragging half-frozen kittens, he might have followed her trail. And if he knew she ended up at Jack's cabin? Jack's breath tightened. The idea made his skin crawl. He walked toward the door, careful not to startle the bobcat resting nearby, and eased the wooden frame open just enough to inspect the porch. The wind shoved snow across the planks, erasing the earlier prints, but beyond the first drift, he could see them. Tracks shaped not by paw or boot, but by the cut of a snowmobile runner. They curved around the clearing, looping dangerously close to the cabin before vanishing into the storm. Too close. Far too close. A chill, deeper than the storm, crawled up Jack's spine. He shut the door, locking it firmly, then slid the heavy bar across the frame, a precaution he hadn't used in years. His cabin had always felt safe. Tonight, it felt watched. He turned back to the mother bobcat, her breathing steadier now, her eyes half open as she tracked his movement. He knelt beside her and kept his voice steady. "You didn't just escape a storm, did you? You escaped something else too." The wind battered the roof, trying to pry its way in. Jack stayed there beside her, listening to the storm and the slow, fragile breaths of the tiny family now depending on him. He didn't know whether Briggs was out there, or whether the storm itself was the greater threat. But one thing settled heavily into his chest. Whatever danger she had left behind, she had carried it straight to his door. And he wasn't about to let it find her again.
Hours before the mother bobcat collapsed on Jack's porch, the world she'd built for her newborns had already begun to fall apart. The storm had rolled in faster than any instinct could predict, an avalanche of wind and ice roaring across the high ridge where she'd carved out a shallow den beneath a fallen ponderosa pine. For weeks, it had been enough. A shelter from owls at night and wind during the day. A cradle of moss, dry needles, and the soft belly fur she'd shed before birthing her litter. But storms in the Rockies don't negotiate, and this one didn't intend to spare her. It began with a groan, low, deep, almost like the earth exhaling. The mother bobcat lifted her head, ears pricked. The kittens slept huddled against her stomach, small bodies warm, breaths tiny and rhythmic. Then came another sound, a long crack that vibrated through the den, followed by a tremor in the frozen soil beneath her paws. She stood quickly, instinct screaming a warning she didn't fully understand. Snow outside had already begun to drift high against the entrance, filling the small hollow with a metallic cold that stung her nose. The ponderosa trunk shifted again. Then it split. The roof of the den sagged, wood snapping as snow poured through the collapse. One of the kittens was thrown sideways, rolling into the drift that swallowed half the opening. Another squeaked, startled, its tiny paws flailing. The mother bobcat lunged forward, teeth closing around the scruff of the nearest kitten just as the trunk gave way in a muffled, thunderous drop. Snow surged inward like water from a burst dam. She bounded through the narrow gap before it sealed, the weight of snow dragging across her back. Her muscles screamed in protest. The kitten dangling from her jaws whimpered. Behind her, the other three cried out, a high, frantic chorus muffled by the storm. She spun immediately, kicking desperately at the snow burying the den. Her paws worked in a violent rhythm, slashing and digging, her breath coming in clouds of white vapor. She dug until her claws bled, until her pads tore, until she reached fur. First one kitten, then another. Each she nudged free, checking them with frantic nuzzles, her heart pounding as their tiny bodies trembled in the wind. But the storm didn't stop. It punched at her from all directions, flattening her whiskers and pressing needles of ice into her injured neck. The cold felt like claws scraping her bones. The kittens cried beneath her belly fur, their mewling nearly lost to the roar. She tried to shield them with her body, but the wind was too strong, stealing the heat from them faster than she could give it. Her instincts spun wildly through her mind, find shelter, move them deeper, search for cover. But the landscape had changed into a white blur with no shape, no scent, no direction. Every hollow would be filled, every rock crevice would be frozen. The world had become a death trap. And then she heard it. A faint, unmistakable sound carried on the wind. The growl of a snowmobile engine, distant but too close. A smell followed, bitter, oily, familiar. The same scent that coated the wire that had scarred her neck. The scent of the man who hunted without hunger. Fear balled in her throat. If he had seen her or her kittens, the storm wouldn't be the only threat. She crouched low, shielding the litter beneath her chest as she scanned the whiteout. The snowmobile sound faded, swallowed by wind, but the scent lingered long enough to ignite a memory. The man who had freed her beneath the bridge. His hands steady, his voice low and soft, the strange warmth of his coat. She had watched him afterwards, weeks later, while she recovered in silence beneath a cluster of boulders. She'd seen the smoke from his cabin, watched him cut firewood, heard his truck rumble along the dirt road. She remembered the tone of his voice, the smell of the denim jacket he wore that day, and the quiet care beneath everything he did. Now, with danger edging closer and her den destroyed, her instincts twisted into something more desperate than fear. It wasn't natural, it wasn't rational, but survival has its own blueprint, and sometimes it leads where logic cannot. She nudged the weakest kitten onto her back, gripping another between her teeth. The remaining two pressed against her belly fur, too cold to fight. Then she moved. Slow at first, dragging her torn paws through the rising drift, her legs trembling under the weight of her own body. She didn't walk. She crawled. Inch by inch, through snow that swallowed her up to the shoulders, through wind that tried to flip her onto her side, she dragged herself and her babies forward. Her injured neck throbbed with each pull, the old wound burning like a brand. But she didn't stop. Not even when the storm blinded her. Not even when the snowmobile growled faintly somewhere behind her. For hours, she crawled toward a memory,
toward a scent and a voice she trusted with something deeper than instinct, toward the only human who had ever shown her mercy. By the time the mother bobcat fought her way past the remnants of her collapsed den, the storm had become a living force, one that wanted her still, silent, and buried under the weight of its fury. Snow blasted sideways, tearing at her whiskers and flattening her ears, while drift swallowed her legs so deeply that each step felt like lifting boulders strapped to her body. Her injured paw, the one mangled by the wire months earlier, throbbed with every movement, sending sharp jolts through her shoulder. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Her kittens clung to her, one held in her jaws, two tucked beneath her belly fur, the last draped weakly over her back, tiny bodies shivering with a cold that could steal life in minutes. The storm robbed the world of color and direction. Landmarks she knew as well as her own pulse vanished beneath white chaos. Trees she once navigated by became ghostly shapes blurred behind sheets of wind. Even her sharp sense of smell, her compass through forests and seasons, could barely fight through the freezing air. But she had something stronger than instinct now. Memory. The scent of pine smoke drifting from a cabin roof. The tone of a human voice that had steadied her breath when she hung helpless in a snare. The warmth of hands that freed her when the wire cut into her throat. Those things lived in her mind like distant beacons, flickering through the storm, and she followed them. She moved in slow, grueling arcs, carving a path through drifts that reached her shoulders. Every few steps she paused, lowering her body so her kittens wouldn't be exposed to the wind slicing across the open ridge. Their tiny claws clung to her fur, their cries faint and fading. She kept moving. Crawl, lift, drag. Crawl, lift, drag. The rhythm of survival. Hours earlier, the snowmobile had roared across the slope, leaving a trail of danger in its wake. The scent of the man who set snares still clung to the wind, bitter, metallic, predatory. The mother bobcat had learned to fear that smell long before the wire choked her neck. And tonight, as she carried her newborns through the storm, the distant hum of that machine echoed behind her like a nearing shadow. It pushed her harder, forcing her body to do things no creature her size should survive. Her paws bled in the cold, leaving small, dark stains in the snow that vanished within seconds under wind-driven drifts. Her legs trembled from exhaustion, her breaths becoming shallow, almost spasmodic. Twice she stumbled, collapsing with her chin in the snow. Each time the kitten and her jaws whimpered softly, reminding her what failure would mean. She forced herself up again, shaking, slipping, climbing. By the time she reached the edge of the western slope, her body felt hollow, empty of everything except the raw urge to get her baby somewhere warm. The snow was deeper here, blown into waves that hid fallen branches and rocks beneath them. She pushed through, dragging her body more than walking, her pace slowing as the storm clawed at her with renewed force. Her muscles trembled violently now. The kitten on her back slid sideways, barely holding on. She paused, nudged it gently with her shoulder, then pressed her neck against its tiny body until it stopped slipping. Every movement burned, every breath scraped her lungs, but she continued on. Her world narrowed to two truths. The storm would kill her litter within the hour, and there was only one place left to go: the human. She remembered watching him from the forest weeks after he freed her, how he stacked firewood, how smoke curled from the chimney of his cabin in winter, how warm light spilled from the windows. She had never approached, but she had memorized the route. A fallen juniper, a bend in the ravine, a ridge she'd crossed 100 times during quiet dawns before she ever had her kittens of her own. Now, through the storm's white chaos, she searched for those shapes with desperate precision. She found the ravine first, though it was nearly filled with snow, just a shadow where the ground dipped. She slid into it, the drift swallowing her legs entirely. Then she climbed out the other side, her muscles shaking from the effort. She collapsed once more, panting. The kitten in her jaws limped now. She nudged it gently, her heart beating in frantic pulses until its tiny chest fluttered weakly. Still alive. Barely. She pushed on. Minutes lost meaning. Only movement mattered, only distance. She crossed the next ridge on trembling limbs, then another. With each step, her world dimmed at the edges, the storm swallowing more of her strength. At last, through the swirling snow, a faint glow appeared, a smear of yellow piercing the storm's white wall. Light. The cabin. She forced her legs into motion, dragging her body toward the glow. Her paws sunk deep, muscles screaming as she pulled herself forward. The kittens barely moved now. Their cries had gone silent. Panic clawed through her chest. She lowered her head, pressing her cheek to their tiny bodies, then pushed forward again with the last strength she possessed. When she finally reached the steps of Jack's porch, she collapsed fully, her legs folding beneath her. The warm scent of human, wood smoke, and safety drifted from the door. She lifted her head once, just enough to nudge her kittens closer to the wooden frame, then scratched at the door with a paw that barely moved. It was the last thing she had to give. Seconds later, the door opened, spilling warm light into the storm, and her long, brutal journey found its end.
When Jack first lifted the mother bobcat into his cabin, the warmth inside was so gentle compared to the violence of the storm that it almost felt unreal. The door shut behind them with a deep, muffled thud, sealing out the blizzard's roar. For a moment, Jack simply stood there, cradling the trembling weight of a creature who had trusted him in a way no wild animal should. The soft glow from the stove caught the frost on her fur, turning it into something that looked like shattered glass. Her breath quivered weakly against his chest. She felt far too light, like her strength had been burned out of her long before she reached his porch. He carried her to the blanket already laid beside the stove, easing her down carefully so as not to disturb the kittens that lay warming in their towels. The mother's eyes fluttered open at the sight of them. Even exhausted beyond reason, she tried to push herself toward them, her body driven by instinct stronger than pain. Jack gently steadied her with one hand, murmuring, "Easy, they're safe. You did it." Her head lowered slowly, settling near the bundles where her kittens lay. The faint rise and fall of her chest steadied, if only slightly. Jack watched her carefully, listening to every breath, every shift of her paws. He'd treated injured wildlife before: deer tangled in fencing, an owl clipped by a truck, fox kits sick with mange, but he'd never witnessed anything like this. She wasn't here because she wandered close. She wasn't here because she was confused by hunger or shelter. She was here because she remembered him. The thought rattled him more deeply than the storm hammering outside. He rose to fetch his emergency kit from the storage cabinet, a metal case filled with antiseptic, gauze, thermal blankets, and tools he prayed he wouldn't need tonight. When he returned to her side, he noticed something that tightened his throat. Her body wasn't just shaking from exhaustion, it was twitching with delayed shock, every muscle still braced from the impossible journey she'd forced herself through. Her paws, raw and bleeding, flexed faintly against the blanket. Snow still clung to the fur around her eyes, where frost had formed tiny white crystals. Jack knelt beside her, his hands steady now, though a deep ache pressed behind his ribs. "You're tough. Tougher than most people I've known." He unwrapped her front paw first, the one scarred months ago. Beneath the ice-encrusted fur, the old wound had swollen from cold and strain. Fresh cuts crossed the weakened flesh in thin red lines. She winced once, a soft, sharp sound barely audible. Jack paused immediately, lowering his voice. "I know. I'm with you. I'm not here to hurt you." The flash of trust in her amber eyes struck him hard. He resumed cleaning the wound, working slowly, speaking in low, even tones. The storm's howl seemed distant now, replaced by the soft hiss of antiseptic and the quiet, fragile breaths of kittens inching closer to life. As he wrapped her injured leg, something flickered in the corner of his peripheral vision. A shadow passed near the window, too fast to identify, too vague to confirm. Jack's eyes snapped toward the glass, but the wind smothered everything beyond a blur of white. Maybe it was a branch bending under ice. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe, just maybe, it was someone still roaming in the storm. He stayed still for several seconds, listening. No footsteps, no engines, only wind chewing at the siding. He forced himself to breathe normally. "Focus," he told himself. "She needs you now." Jack shifted back toward the kittens, lifting one gently to check its temperature. The tiny creature stirred, letting out a faint mewl that seemed to echo louder than the storm. Jack's shoulders dropped in relief. If they were vocalizing, they were pulling through. Beside him, the mother bobcat stretched her neck, trying to move closer to the sound. Jack quickly supported her weight with one hand, murmuring, "Easy. They're safe. You did it." But she kept pushing, her instinct refusing to let her lie still while her babies cried. Jack finally gathered all 4 kittens and placed them within reach of her, lining them along the edge of the blanket where they could feel her warmth but not overwhelm her weakened body. The moment they touched her fur, the faintest vibration rippled through her, something like a purr so weak it barely stirred the air. Jack swallowed hard, the tightness in his chest returning. He watched her gently nudge each kitten with the tip of her nose, confirming they were whole. And finally, she exhaled, a shuddering release that sounded like surrender and relief and gratitude all at once. "You did everything you could. Now it's my turn." He stayed beside her as the fire crackled, letting the heat seep into his bones. The storm raged on, pounding the cabin with icy fists. But inside, the world had reduced itself to something small, fragile, and fiercely alive. A man, a mother, 4 tiny lives fighting back against the cold. And somewhere outside, hidden by the dark, was a threat Jack still couldn't name. For the first time since the storm began, the cabin fell into a strange, almost sacred quiet. The fire snapped softly, the stove hummed, and the kitten's faint, breathy mews blended into the warm air like tiny echoes of life trying its hardest to return. The mother bobcat, exhausted beyond anything Jack had ever witnessed, lay half-curled around her litter. Her breaths were slow but steady now, each one a fragile victory. Jack sat nearby on the floor, watching her with the same focus he used to give to trapped firefighters or wounded hikers. Attention sharpened not by fear, but by a deep, protective resolve. He checked her paws again. The bleeding had slowed. The swelling in her neck seemed less angry under the dim cabin light. Her eyes opened every few minutes, just long enough to confirm her kittens were still beside her. Each time she looked at Jack, the moment stretched with a quiet understanding. Not of ownership, not of dependence, but of something instinctual and fragile, mutual recognition born from suffering neither could explain aloud. Outside, the storm's rage softened into a thick, suffocating blanket of white noise. It was the kind of lull that often came before the next violent gust, a deceptive pause. Jack stood and approached the window cautiously. Snow pressed high against the glass, distorting the outside world into shapeless waves. Nothing moved. No trees, no shadows, no signs of the tracks he'd seen earlier. Still, he couldn't shake the unease. He scanned the clearing, the tree line, the slope leading toward the ravine. No snowmobile, no headlights, no human silhouette. But he knew better than to trust what he could or couldn't see during a whiteout. When he returned to the mother bobcat's side, he lowered himself slowly to the floor, stretching a stiff leg that protested with a twinge. He was getting older. Nights like this reminded him. His body wasn't built for crawling around cabins tending to wounded wildlife until dawn, but his heart, stubborn as it was, didn't seem to care. The faint crackle of radio static startled him. He looked toward the desk as Riley's voice cut through the static in broken fragments. "Storm shifting east. Road's gone. Stay put. And Jack, keep your rifle close tonight. Just in case." Then the radio fell silent again. Jack swallowed hard, glancing automatically toward the corner where the rifle leaned against the wall. He hadn't touched it in years. He'd kept it more out of habit than necessity, a relic from the early days when he didn't know the mountain well enough to trust it.
Now its presence felt heavier than before, more relevant. He pushed himself to his feet, walked over and picked it up. The cold metal pressed into his palm, oddly grounding. He checked the chamber, still clean, still ready, and set it beside the door. He didn't want to use it. God, he hoped he wouldn't have to, but he'd seen men like Briggs thrive in weather like this, using storms as screens, as excuses, as cover. A man like that didn't stop because snow fell. If anything, he used it. Jack returned to the mother bobcat, lowering himself back onto the floor. One of the kittens shifted restlessly, its tiny flank rising and falling with new strength. Another let out a soft, breathy chirp and burrowed closer to its mother's side. The sight eased something inside him, something tight and aching he hadn't realized he'd carried into the night. "You're fighters," he whispered, "every one of you." The mother bobcat lifted her head by a fraction, just enough to touch her nose to the weakest kitten. Her body trembled from the effort. Jack watched her carefully, his voice dipping even lower. "You can rest now. They're safe." Outside, a sudden gust slammed into the cabin wall, rattling the windows hard enough for Jack to make his heart jump. The mother bobcat's ears flicked, instinctively alert despite her exhaustion. Jack leaned slightly closer, murmuring, "Just the wind. Nothing's getting in." But he didn't fully believe it, not with the snowmobile tracks still fresh in his mind. The room settled again. Heat radiated gently from the stove, wrapping the cabin in a cocoon of warmth that felt almost unreal compared to the ferocity of the storm. Jack sat back against the wall, letting the quiet seep into him, feeling the weight of a long night pressing on his shoulders. He should have been exhausted. Instead, he found himself wide awake, listening to every sound, every creak of the cabin's bones, every sigh of the wind, and every quiet, rhythmic breath from the mother bobcat. In that silence, he realized something he hadn't admitted to himself in years. He cared. More than he should. More than was safe. And as the storm groaned outside, Jack knew this night wasn't anywhere near over.
The storm did not let up. If anything, it grew heavier, thickening into a relentless white curtain that erased the world beyond Jack's cabin walls. The wind moaned low, dragging across the roof like a warning. Inside, the fire threw a warm glow across the small room, casting long shadows that flickered against the logs. Jack stayed awake, sitting cross-legged beside the mother bobcat, refusing to let exhaustion win. Too much had happened. Too much could still go wrong. The kittens slept now, gathered in a tight bundle against their mother's side. Their breathing steadied into soft rhythms, tiny, fragile proof that life was returning. The mother bobcat, though barely conscious, shifted just enough to nuzzle them closer beneath her chest. Her instincts never faltered, not even in collapse. Jack watched her with a quiet awe that warmed him more than the stove. She had almost died to bring them here. She had given every shred of her strength, body ripped apart, paws torn open, breath stolen by cold, and still she'd protected them. Jack rubbed his eyes and stood up to stretch, joints stiff from hours on the floor. The cabin creaked under a heavy gust, and he paused, listening. He stepped toward the window, careful not to make noise that might startle the bobcat. Outside was nothing but a wall of white. Snow drifted high against the cabin, so high he could barely see the railing of the porch. A storm like this could bury a man alive if he ventured too far. And yet, something pricked at him. A sense he'd learned to trust back when he fought fires in mountain towns,
when the silence told you more than the noise. He leaned slightly closer to the glass, squinting through the swirling snow. No shadows, no movement, but the unease remained, stretching thin wires of tension through his chest. He checked the rifle leaning against the door, loaded, ready. He didn't want to use it, but knowing Briggs might be somewhere in that storm had carved a cold hollowness in his gut. Men like Briggs didn't care about weather advisories or common sense. They didn't even care about the law. They cared about trophies and money. A bobcat pelt brought profit. A mother with kittens brought more. Jack shuddered at the thought. He returned to the stove to stir the embers, adding another log. The warmth flared brighter, and the glow spilled across the mother bobcat's face. Her eyelids fluttered open, the gold in her eyes reflecting the firelight. She watched him, not with fear, not with the aggression common to wildcats, but with something else. Quiet recognition. The same look she'd given him under the bridge months ago. A look that said, "You are not my enemy." Jack crouched beside her again. "Hey," he whispered, voice low and steady. "You're safe. I'm not letting anything touch you tonight." Her ears twitched at his tone, and she lowered her head back onto the blanket, her ribs rising and falling in tired arcs. One of the kittens stirred, stretching its small paws before rolling closer to her warmth. Jack gently tucked the blanket around them, the way he'd once done with Laura's shoulders on hospital nights when the cold seemed to bite deeper. He forced that memory back down. Tonight wasn't about grief. It was about survival. Hers, the kitten's, and perhaps, in some small way, his own. He checked the mother bobcat's paws again, lifting one gently. The bleeding had almost stopped. Her pads were cracked, torn, raw from the miles of ice. He cleaned them once more, feeling an unexpected sting at the back of his throat. "How did you walk so far? Through all that? How?" She didn't answer, of course, but the bravery in her battered body said enough. A sudden crack outside made Jack stiffen. Not a branch, not wind, something harder. He rose quickly and moved to the door, listening with every inch of his body. The mother bobcat lifted her head too, her instincts flaring, despite her exhaustion. Jack held his breath. Silence. Then, a faint scraping noise. Slow. Dragging. Jack's pulse hammered. He rested his hand on the rifle, fingers brushing the cold metal. He didn't want to use it, but knowing Briggs might be somewhere in that storm had carved a cold hollowness in his gut. He didn't want to open the door, not without knowing, but he couldn't ignore a sound like that, not here, not tonight. He unlatched the top lock and cracked the door open an inch, cold air rushing in like a blade. Snow swirled violently in the porch light, but through it, just barely, he saw something half buried in the drift. Not a person. Not Briggs. A snare. A wire snare, frozen and torn from its stake, lying coiled like a dead snake in the snow, carried by the storm, or dropped by someone who passed too close. Jack felt his breath catch. The storm didn't bring that here. Someone had been near my cabin. Recently. He shut the door hard and slid the heavy bar back into place. The mother bobcat's eyes met his as he turned. She didn't understand human dangers, but she knew fear, knew pursuit, knew the scent of the man who heard her, and Jack felt her trembling from across the room. He lowered himself back beside her, lowering his voice again. "Don't worry. He won't get near this cabin. And if he tries," his eyes flicked to the rifle, "he'll answer to me." Inside the cabin, the kittens slept on, unaware of the danger curling just outside the walls. The storm roared, the night deepened, and Jack kept watch, because now, whether he intended to or not, he was part of their survival.
Morning came slowly, gray, muted, and heavy, like the world outside had been buried in thick wool. The storm had not stopped, only shifted, settling into a dense, suffocating quiet that pressed against the cabin walls. Jack hadn't slept. He dozed for minutes at a time in his chair, waking at every crack of wood, every gust of wind, every kitten's rustle. Fatigue pulled at his eyes, but something deeper kept him alert, a sense that danger still hovered close, hidden beneath the hush of snowfall. The mother bobcat stirred first. A faint tremor rippled through her shoulders as she tried to shift her weight. Jack moved immediately, kneeling beside her with the slow, careful movements he'd learned during years of handling injured animals. Her amber eyes opened, slow but deliberate, focusing on him as though she was checking whether he was real or part of the fevered dream she must have been living through the night. "You're still with me," Jack whispered. "Good. Stay with me." She tried to lift her head fully, but her legs flattened again under her weight. Jack steadied her gently, guiding her back onto the blanket. Her strength wasn't ready for anything more yet. The kittens sensed her awakening and wriggled closer, their tiny heads nudging her chest and neck. The smallest one, still the most fragile, let out a faint, broken chirp. The sound made the mother's ears perk, and she lowered her head just enough to touch her nose to its back. Jack felt something tighten behind his ribs. That instinct, so immediate, so fierce, was the reason she had made it through a blizzard most humans wouldn't have survived. He reached for a small dish of warmed water he had set near the stove and placed it carefully in front of her. The bobcat hesitated, her nose twitching. She watched Jack's hand, watched the steam rising from the dish, then looked at her kittens again, as if making sure this wasn't a trick. "It's just water," he said softly. "You need it." The mother bobcat leaned forward slowly, her tongue barely flicking the surface. She drank in short, weak laps, nothing like the confident motions of a healthy predator, but the sound of her drinking felt like a small miracle in the quiet room. Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. She pulled away after only a few sips, but any sign of improvement mattered. He checked the bandages on her paws next. The gauze was holding, though the wounds beneath were raw and angry. He'd have to clean them again before midday. He let his fingers hover above her fur, not touching this time, only waiting for her signal. Her eyes flicked up to him, calm, accepting. It was permission. He cleaned the old wounds gently, murmuring steady reassurances the whole time. She didn't growl, didn't swat, didn't even tense. Instead, she lay still, her trust so quiet and profound that it made Jack's chest ache. He'd worked with wildlife for decades. Trust like this didn't happen. Not naturally, not ever. But this wasn't nature. This was survival. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and let the moment settle. The kittens were growing more restless now, hungry but still too weak to fully explore. One attempted to climb over the others, slipping awkwardly and rolling onto its back, tiny paws flailing. Jack's lips twitched in the faintest smile. Even in all this pain, life had its stubborn ways of showing up.
He stood and stretched, stepping to the window to check the storm again. Snow had swallowed half the porch. The wind had calmed, but the world remained a white maze, thick, blinding, impenetrable. And then he saw them. Tracks. Snowmobile tracks, half filled with drifts, but still visible curving around the edge of the clearing. Fresh, made hours ago at most. They didn't lead toward the cabin, but circled it. Once, twice. As if someone was scouting, watching, testing how close they could get. Jack felt the cold slide deeper into his bones. Briggs had been here, close enough to see the light from Jack's window, close enough to follow the mother bobcat's trail, close enough to know she was inside. Jack stepped back from the window slowly, forcing his breath to remain steady. The mother bobcat watched him, her ears tilting in response to the tension tightening his body. "It's okay," he whispered, though the lie tasted sharp. "You're safe in here." He walked to the door and checked the locks again, the heavy bar, the bolt, the reinforced hinges, all secure. But the storm wouldn't protect them anymore, and the snow wouldn't hide tracks forever. He returned to the bobcat, sitting close enough for her to sense the steadiness in his breathing. The kittens wriggled beneath her chin, warming themselves. She curled her tail slightly around them, offering the only comfort her exhausted body could manage. "You trusted me to save you," Jack murmured. "I won't let anything take you from here. Not the storm, not him." His voice wasn't loud, it wasn't fierce, but it held the same steel he once carried into burning buildings, a promise forged in loss, in regret, and in the fragile hope that this time he could make a difference. Outside, the storm faded into a heavy stillness. Inside, the fragile alliance between man and wild mother deepened into something neither entirely understood, but both depended on to survive.
By late morning, the storm had settled into a deep, oppressive stillness. So still it felt unnatural, like the mountain was holding its breath. The world outside was buried under a thickness of snow that softened every sound, every movement, every danger. But inside the cabin, life was quietly rising again. The mother bobcat began to stir with more intention, not just the weak twitching of exhaustion, but the slow gathering of strength. Jack noticed it immediately. She lifted her head, fully this time. Her movement was careful, controlled, but steady. The kittens reacted at once, wriggling toward her belly, their tiny bodies pulsing with new warmth. One attempted to climb over her foreleg, falling sideways with a soft thump. The mother bobcat nudged it gently back into the fold, tucking her tail around them. Jack sat a few feet away, letting her adjust without pressure. The trust between them was growing, but he moved with the same caution he used around smoke-filled rooms years ago, measured, respectful, alert. She'd nearly died saving her young. Her instincts would always be sharp. "You're stronger today," Jack murmured, keeping his voice low, steady. "That's good. Real good." Her eyes flicked to him, steady, aware. It wasn't the fearful stare of a wild animal cornered indoors. It was an appraisal, a quiet acknowledgement of the man she remembered pulling a wire snare off her neck. She didn't growl, she didn't flinch, but her muscles tensed, the way a mother's body always tenses when her young are near danger, even if the danger is only imagined. Jack shifted his weight, palms open on his knees. "You're safe, I promise." He didn't know how much she understood, but something in her gaze softened, just a breath's worth. He reached for the shallow dish of warmed water and placed it a foot closer to her. She watched his hands like a hawk, pupils narrowing slightly.
Only when he backed away did she lean down to drink. Her tongue moved with more strength this time, and when she finished, she lifted her head with a slow, controlled inhale, as if the water alone had revived something deep inside her. The fire crackled. Outside, snow slid from the roof in soft thuds, but beneath that gentle rhythm, Jack felt something darker lurking. The tracks he'd seen earlier still weighed on his mind, fresh snowmobile lines arcing around the cabin like a warning. Briggs had been near, too near, and a man like that didn't abandon a trail, not if he was following something. He stood and walked to the window again. The clearing was blinding in its brightness, the snow reflecting light like a sheet of glass. But beneath that brightness was a silence that pressed on him like a hand on the chest. No birds, no movement, not even falling snow, just stillness. He scanned the tree line. No shadows, no signs of a snowmobile, but his instincts, sharp from years on fire lines and nights spent listening for collapsing timber, told him the danger wasn't gone. It was simply quiet. He turned back to the Bobcat. She had shifted now, slowly curling her body around her kittens in a protective crescent. She wasn't collapsing anymore. She was guarding, and her eyes, though heavy with fatigue, remained fixed on Jack, watching every movement. "You don't trust this quiet either, do you?" he said softly. The kitten closest to her nudged her chin, and she lowered her head to groom it with tired licks. Jack felt a warmth spread through him at the sight. Not happiness, not exactly, but something close. Something like meaning. He reached for the venison he'd thawed earlier and cut it into small pieces. Approaching her with food was a risk. Feeding a wild predator always was, but she needed strength, and he needed her to understand he wasn't a threat. He set the plate on the floor halfway between them. The aroma drifted toward her. She lifted her head, nostrils flaring. Only when he backed away did she lean down to drink. Her tongue moved with more strength this time, and when she finished, she lifted her head with a slow, controlled inhale, as if the water alone had revived something deep inside her. The mother bobcat hesitated. Instinct warred inside her. The instinct to protect her young, the instinct to distrust anything human, and the instinct to feed her starving body. After several long seconds, she chose. With a weak but determined step, she leaned forward and took the first piece into her mouth. Jack's breath left him in a long, quiet exhale. She chewed slowly, painfully, but she ate another piece and another. "You're coming back. Good. I need you strong." He didn't say the rest out loud, because the man who hurt you might come back too. The mother bobcat finished the meat, then gathered her kittens with a tired sweep of her foreleg, pressing them close. Jack watched her, a fragile, wild mother reclaiming her strength inch by inch. In the womb-like quiet of the snowbound cabin, man and bobcat regarded each other not as opposites, not as threats, but as survivors, bound by a storm, a night of desperation, and a danger waiting patiently outside.
By late afternoon, the storm had surrendered. It didn't end gently. It simply stopped, like a door slammed shut somewhere beyond the ridge. The sudden quiet was so absolute that it startled Jack awake after his first real doze in nearly 36 hours. He sat upright in the chair, stiff and disoriented, blinking at the strange, heavy silence pressing against the cabin walls. The fire had burned low, but still glowed warm in the hearth. The mother bobcat lay curled around her kittens, each one nestled into the soft hollow of her belly. They were breathing stronger now, still tiny,
still fragile, but undeniably alive. When Jack stood and stretched, a faint pop sounded in his shoulder. "Age catching up," he muttered. But it wasn't pain he felt. It was something else, something like cautious hope. He stepped toward the door and listened, carefully. No wind, no scraping branches, no mechanical growl of a snowmobile engine. Only the occasional soft thump of snow sliding from the roof. The air felt strange, as if the world outside was waiting. He grabbed his boots, pulled on his coat, and cracked the door open. The cold hit him first, sharp, still, untouched by wind. Then the brightness flooded in. The storm had sculpted the valley into a world of white mounds and glassy drifts, each one glittering like crushed diamonds in the late afternoon sun. The sky above was clear and painfully blue, the kind of blue that only comes after the worst storms. Jack stepped out, snow crunching beneath his boots. The drifts rose nearly to his waist, the porch railing was half buried, and the clearing, usually wide open, looked like a blank page. Almost. He squinted, stepping farther out, scanning with the instincts he'd relied on for decades. Tracks. A fresh line of snowmobile tracks cut across the southern ridge, partially filled but unmistakable. Jack's jaw clenched. Briggs had moved through here after the storm or during it. Either way, he wasn't far, and he wasn't finished. Jack followed the tracks with his eyes until they vanished into the tree line. No footprints accompanied them. The rider hadn't stopped, but the looping path around the clearing from earlier, that had been different. That had been deliberate. He turned and looked back toward the cabin. Through the window, he could see the mother bobcat watching him, not moving, not panicking, just watching with those amber eyes that seemed to see more than any animal should. He trudged across the clearing, circling the cabin perimeter with slow, deliberate steps. His boots sank deep, the snow resisting each movement. He checked the woodpile, the shed, the fence line. Nothing disturbed, no broken branches, no fresh prints other than those of the storm itself. But when he rounded the far corner of the shed, he stopped cold. There, half buried in a drift, lay another snare. New, coiled, ready. Not dropped by accident this time. Left. Placed. A taunt. Jack crouched, brushing snow from the wire. It gleamed under the weak sunlight, sharp and unforgiving. His stomach tightened with an anger he hadn't felt in years, an anger he used to feel on fire lines when people ignored evacuation orders or when arsonists torched hillsides for thrills. Briggs wasn't hunting for food. He wasn't trapping for survival. He was doing it because he wanted control, because cruelty was a habit he enjoyed. Jack lifted the snare, testing its tension. Strong. Too strong for rabbits or foxes. This was built for cats, lynx, bobcat if he got lucky, or unlucky. He stood and looked back at the cabin. The mother bobcat still watched him through the glass, her body curled protectively around her litter. She wasn't safe here, not from a man like Briggs, not from someone who had likely seen her tracks and followed them through the storm. Jack walked back to the cabin with long, determined strides. He opened the door, shutting the cold out behind him. The mother's ears flicked as he stepped in. He held up the snare, letting her see it. Her body tensed instantly, her pupils narrowing, a soft growl rumbling in her throat, weak but undeniably. "I know," Jack said quietly. "He's close." He tossed the snare on the table and dropped into his chair, pulling off his gloves. His mind raced, calculating distance, daylight left, possible approaches Briggs might take. The snow had slowed anyone's movement, but it had slowed animals more than men. He exhaled, long and steady, trying to gather calm around the coil of anger inside him. "You didn't just escape a storm," he murmured to the bobcat. "You were running from him." She blinked, slow and deliberate, as if confirming what he already knew. Jack sat forward, elbows on his knees. "You came here because you remembered I helped you once." He paused. "So I'll help you again. Only this time, I won't let you walk away hurt." His voice was low, steady, the voice of a man who'd once run into burning houses without hesitation. He looked at the kittens, then at their mother, then at the snare. A storm had brought her to his door, but a man might try to take her from it. Jack reached for the rifle leaning near the door. He checked the chamber, checked the safety, and set it beside his chair. Not as a threat, not as a promise of violence, but as a simple, quiet statement, he would not let harm cross his threshold. The mountain was calm now, but Jack knew better. This was just the clearing before the next storm.
By the next morning, sunlight poured into the valley with a sharp clarity that only comes after a blizzard. Every branch was coated in glassy ice, sparkling like someone had hung 1,000 Christmas lights across the tree line. The calm looked peaceful, but Jack felt a tightness in his chest that wouldn't ease. Peace after a storm always made him wary. Storms didn't just end, they paused, they gathered, they waited. Inside the cabin, the mother bobcat had regained enough strength to stand without trembling. Her kittens clung to her legs as she shifted positions, their tiny paws kneading at her fur. She groomed them with slow, deliberate strokes, as though reassuring them the world was safe again, even though she wasn't convinced it was. Jack crouched nearby with a small dish of venison. "You're stronger," he murmured. "That's good. You're gonna need it." He didn't say why. He didn't say Briggs's name, but the mother bobcat's ears flicked, as if she sensed the unspoken warning in the room. It was time to let her stretch her legs, time for the kittens to feel the world beyond the cabin walls, but time for Jack to keep a close eye on the clearing. He slipped on his boots, checked the snow around the porch through the window, then unlatched the door. A gust of crisp mountain air swept inside. The bobcat stiffened first, her instinct spiking. The kittens froze, tiny bodies pressed close to her. Jack stepped back, giving her space. She would decide if it was safe. Finally, she rose, still cautious, but not afraid. She nudged her kittens one by one toward the open door. They resisted at first, mewling softly, unused to the cold brightness outside. But she coaxed them with gentle nudges until the first tiny paw stepped onto the snow-covered porch. A soft chirp escaped the mother's throat, a sound Jack had only heard once before during the storm, and the kittens followed her out. Jack stood behind them, the warm air from the cabin brushing his back, the cold air stinging his face. He watched in quiet awe as the family of 5 stepped down into the snow. The kittens reacted instantly, wide eyes, exaggerated bouncing movements, unsure where to place their paws. The snow was deep enough to swallow their legs, so they hopped clumsily, creating a zigzag trail that made Jack smile despite the heaviness in his chest. The mother bobcat moved with more confidence, still slow, still stiff, but with purpose. She scanned the tree line, sniffed the wind, listened to the faint creak of branches shifting under the weight of ice. Every sound mattered, every movement meant something. She was teaching them. Jack didn't follow closely, just stepped off the porch and kept a respectful distance. The snow crunched beneath his boots, the sound loud in the otherwise perfect quiet. He kept glancing toward the ridge where he'd seen the snowmobile tracks, his nerves alert. No movement, no engines, but quiet didn't mean safe. The bobcat crouched suddenly, signaling her kittens to freeze. They followed instantly, instinct kicking in even at their age. Jack scanned the clearing. At first, he saw nothing. Then he spotted it, a rabbit trail cutting through the snow. Small imprints, fresh. The mother led her kittens toward it, her movements flowing now, more natural, as though some inner switch had flipped. She nudged each kitten toward the trail, showing them how to smell, how to listen, how to read the snow. One kitten pawed clumsily at the tracks and sunk nose first into a drift. Jack chuckled under his breath. But then, something caught the mother's attention. She froze, not at the rabbit scent, but at the wind direction. She lifted her head, nostrils flaring, eyes narrowing toward the trees on the southern edge of the clearing. Jack's pulse quickened. That was where the snowmobile tracks disappeared. He stepped forward slightly, enough for her to notice he was paying attention. She didn't growl, she didn't retreat. She simply looked from the trees back to her kittens,
as if calculating the balance between teaching and protecting. "Easy," Jack whispered. "Nothing's here right now." He hoped. Slowly, she led her kittens closer to him, closer than she had ever done outside the cabin. It wasn't trust exactly, it was strategy, staying near the one creature she believed wouldn't harm her young. Jack breathed out, long and steady. "You're doing good," he murmured, "real good." He watched as she continued the lesson, showing her kittens how to navigate a fallen branch, how to crouch low in the snow to hide their bodies, how to use silence as a shield. Her movements were still tired, but her instincts were sharp as ever. For a few minutes, Jack let himself believe the danger was far away. The Bobcat family looked almost peaceful moving across the snow, their small forms dotted behind their mother like shadows. It reminded him of photos he'd seen in wildlife magazines, animals thriving, learning, surviving, a world untouched by human cruelty. But then, a distant echo shattered the quiet. A faint engine rumble. Far, but not far enough. The mother bobcat stiffened instantly, her body tightening like a bowstring. The kittens pressed against her legs, their confidence evaporating. Jack's breath caught. Briggs. He stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "Inside, go!" The mother bobcat hesitated only a split second before sweeping her kittens toward the porch. Jack moved with her, his boots pounding through the snow. The engine noise grew a little louder, then faded again, but not enough to ease the tension sinking into his shoulders. Back inside the cabin, the mother bobcat gathered her kittens beneath her body. Her breathing was fast, her eyes locked at Jack as if searching for answers. "I know," Jack whispered. "I heard it too." The storm had passed, but something else was moving through the mountains now. Something human, something dangerous. And this time, Jack wouldn't let it reach her.
The sun slipped behind the ridge earlier than usual, throwing long shadows across the clearing as Jack prepared for what he knew had to come. The air felt heavy, thick with the kind of tension he used to sense on wildfire lines just before the flames changed direction. Something in the mountain silence told him the window for safety was closing, and the bobcat mother, for all her strength and progress, couldn't stay in the cabin much longer. She needed a real den, a safe place to finish raising her young, somewhere Briggs wouldn't find her. Jack stood by the table, sharpening the small hand axe he used for splitting kindling. Not because he needed the axe tonight, but because the familiar rhythm kept his hands steady. Metal against stone, slow and even. It helped him think. Behind him, the bobcat mother shifted, nosing her kittens into a tight curl beside her. They had grown stronger, tiny legs firmer, eyes clearer, but they were still far too young to defend themselves. The mother knew it, her body curved protectively around them, her ears swiveling at every creak of wood or gust of wind outside. Jack set the axe down and knelt beside them. "Tomorrow morning," he whispered, "I'll show you the new place. Up near the ridge, no traps, good cover, plenty of water." The bobcat mother blinked slowly. It was the same silent acknowledgement she'd given him when she allowed him to carry her into the cabin days earlier. She understood more than he'd ever expect from a wild creature. Another soft engine rumble echoed across the valley. Farther this time, but unmistakable. Jack stood quickly, moving to the window. The slope to the south remained empty, no movement, no flashing metal, no snow spraying up from treads. But it didn't matter. Briggs was circling the area, testing it, looking for something he'd lost during the storm. "Not tonight. You're not getting near them tonight," he muttered. He pulled the curtains closed, stoked the fire, and brought out another blanket for the kittens.
their tiny bodies pressed closer together, mewling softly until their mother lay back down to calm them. Hours passed. The fire hissed, the wind picked up again, sweeping loose snow across the roof. Jack sat upright in the chair, old injury in his shoulder throbbing, but he didn't close his eyes, not with that engine still echoing in his memory. Near midnight, the mother bobcat suddenly lifted her head, alert, listening. Jack froze, straining to hear what she heard. At first, there was nothing. Then he felt it before he heard it. A vibration along the floorboards, faint as a heartbeat. A snowmobile, coming closer. Jack reached for the rifle he leaned against the wall. He didn't aim it, just held it across his lap. He wasn't going to shoot unless he had no other choice, but he wouldn't be caught unprepared. The mother bobcat rose, her body rigid, ears pricked forward. Instinct screamed through her posture. She paced once, then twice, stopping only when her kittens cried at the sudden movement. She returned to them, pressing her nose against their heads, but her gaze kept shifting to the door. The engine stopped. Dead silence followed. Jack's pulse hammered. "Stay with them," he whispered to her, though he knew she wouldn't understand the words, only the tone, quiet, protective, steady. He moved to the window, pulling the curtain back just an inch. The moonlight cast a silver sheen across the clearing. At first, he saw nothing. Then he spotted movement, a faint silhouette near the tree line, too large to be an animal, too stiff to be anything but a man. Briggs. He wasn't approaching, not yet, just watching, studying the cabin, trying to read whether the storm had driven animals to shelter here, whether the tracks he'd followed belonged to prey worth catching. He let the curtain fall. "Coward," he muttered under his breath. Briggs had always been that type. Bold with traps, bold when his victims were bleeding and helpless, but reluctant to confront anything that looked back at him. Minutes crawled by. Then the snowmobile engine fired up again, retreating toward the ridge. Jack waited until it was nothing but a fading buzz swallowed by the mountain. Only then did he exhale. He returned to the bobcat. She watched him intently, chest rising and falling too fast. He crouched slowly, careful not to make sudden movements. "You were right to come here," he said. "You're going to be all right, but we need to move at first light." Her ears twitched, but she didn't growl. She simply curled back around her kittens, sheltering them with her body as if understanding that danger had passed, for now. Jack sat back in the chair, rifle beside him, and waited for dawn. He wasn't afraid of Briggs, not anymore. Not after what he'd seen this mother fight through. Not after she had walked herself half to death to bring her young to safety. He'd protect her the way she had protected those tiny lives. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. Inside, the fire hummed softly. And in the quiet between those sounds, Jack planned their next move. A new den, a safer home, a path Briggs would never be able to track. Because tomorrow would be the final crossing, the moment when he returned what wasn't his to keep and she reclaimed the wild life she was meant to lead.
Dawn came quietly, slipping between the pines in long, pale streaks of gold. The storm's brutality felt like a distant memory now, replaced by the crisp stillness of a new morning. Jack hadn't slept a minute, but he didn't feel tired. Purpose had a way of holding him upright, the same way it had kept him moving through burning timber back in his firefighting days. He stepped outside first, crunching a narrow path through the deep snow with deliberate, heavy steps. The air was sharp enough to sting his lungs, but the silence was calmer than the night before. No engines, no movement, just the mountain breathing again. Behind him, the mother bobcat appeared at the doorway. She didn't rush, she didn't hesitate. She stood tall, her body stronger today, her eyes bright with awareness. The kittens crowded around her legs, mewling softly, eager for warmth and movement. Jack smiled at them, feeling something warm bloom in his chest. "You're ready," he murmured. She didn't blink. She didn't need to. Jack led them slowly into the clearing, each step measured so the kittens could follow the packed trail. Their tiny paws left small dotted lines alongside his boot prints, fragile yet determined. The sun glowed across their fur, lighting them like embers smoldering back to life. It took nearly half an hour to reach the ridge where the new den waited. Jack had cleared the entrance earlier in the week, dragging fallen branches away and checking for signs of predators. The rock overhang formed a natural shelter, dry, deep, shaded. A perfect place for a recovering mother and her growing young. The mother bobcat stepped forward first, testing the air. She lowered her head and sniffed the ground, then the rock wall, then the narrow entrance. Something in her posture shifted. Recognition, maybe. Approval. Then she turned and nudged the first kitten forward. Jack stood several yards back, hands in his coat pockets, letting them explore in peace. That space, those few yards, felt heavier than any distance he had ever stood across from someone, because this wasn't just a den. It wasn't just a relocation. It was the moment he'd been moving toward since she first collapsed at his door. The bobcat family disappeared into the den, the kitten's playful chirps echoing briefly off the stone. Jack let himself breathe, shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. The danger had not vanished. Briggs still roamed these woods, but the new den was hidden well, shielded from the trails he typically traveled, and Jack would keep watch as long as he lived here. He crouched near the entrance, not close enough to intrude, but close enough to speak softly. "This is yours, a place nobody will take from you." For a moment, nothing moved inside the dark hollow. Then he saw them, two amber eyes glowing gently from the shadows. The mother bobcat stepped forward, not out of the den, but to the threshold. Her gaze met his, steady and unhurried. And in that single look, Jack felt something pass between them. Not gratitude. Wild animals don't feel gratitude the way humans do, but recognition, understanding, a kind of silent truce forged through storms, danger, and a long night when trust was the only thing keeping her alive. She blinked once, slowly, deliberately. Jack felt something sting behind his eyes. He swallowed hard. "Take care of them," he whispered. "Take care of yourself." With another slow blink, she turned and vanished back into the dark, her spotted tail sweeping once across the entrance before disappearing completely. Jack stood there longer than he needed to, listening to the tiny sounds inside, the kittens scrambling over each other, the soft rasp of her grooming them, the small noises of a family settling into the home they were always meant to have. As he turned to walk back toward the cabin, a cold gust carried with it a faint sound, distant, muffled by snow and trees, but familiar. A snowmobile engine. Farther away this time, moving in the opposite direction, fading. Briggs was leaving the valley. Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Maybe the storm had pushed Briggs too far off his trail. Maybe he'd given up. Or maybe the mountain itself had chosen to protect what belonged to it. Whatever the reason, it didn't matter anymore. The Bobcat family was safe. He made it halfway across the clearing when something caught his eye. A movement on a low ridge above the den. He looked up sharply. There she was. The mother bobcat had climbed the rock outcropping and now stood poised like a sentinel, her silhouette etched against the pale morning sky. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't running. She stood tall, her body stronger today, her eyes bright with awareness. And then, for the briefest moment, she did something he would think about for years. She dipped her head. A quiet gesture, small, but filled with meaning. Then she turned and slipped back into the trees with the soundless grace only the wild can create. Jack stood there, the cold brushing his face, the early sun warming his shoulders. He felt the weight of the last several days settle deep inside him. Not heavy, but grounding. A reminder of what mattered and what didn't. Of how life, even in its fiercest forms, finds ways to trust again. He walked the rest of the way home in silence. The cabin waited, warm and familiar, and though it felt emptier than before, it also felt full. Full of something he couldn't name, something wild and steady and alive. In the quiet morning light, Jack whispered to the empty clearing, "Goodbye, girl. Be wild. Be whole." And somewhere beyond the pines, a soft bobcat chirp answered him.